All right, back again with Taylor from the Gloucester Daily Times. Taylor, you have an update on the idling trains over in West Gloucester.
Yes, there's been lots of conversation over in West Gloucester about the idling of trains and the noise that they produce. The residents have complained that the trains that should be idling over the Cape Ann Industrial Park are idling in the West Gloucester train station and the neighboring areas as well, and just causing a lot of disruption and noise that is preventing people from sleeping, from working now that they're doing things from a remote. And then for children, for their remote learning, as a lot of people have chosen to have their kids do remote learning this year. And so it's this constant battle that seems to be between the residents and the MBTA as they're trying to figure out the best way to ensure that the trains can go to and from the places they need to go, but at the same time it doesn't seem that the noise is getting any better. So again, a little bit of context, the MBTA is doing this project with the Annisquam Bridge and working on replacing that line, the Rockport line. And so the West Gloucester train station is the last train station on this line. And the trains, before they head southbound, are supposed to wait and then head back. And the problem has been is as these trains are waiting, that they're waiting in the wrong locations. And so that's what's creating a lot of noise and disruption in these residential areas. So the MBTA had in previous meetings stated that they would have them go at the Cape Ann Industrial Park. And they're telling people like this. They've had Keolis, the company that works with them, kind of instructing their engineers to go down there. But when things happen on the ground, on the tracks, the question is, do they actually do this? And the residents are saying they're not. And so a representative from the MBTA and Bruce Tarr, Senate Minority Leader, came down and kind of held a site visit over the West Gloucester train station earlier this week to discuss things, talk about what they're promising to the residents, listen to residents' concerns. And this was an in-person meeting. And upwards of 20, 30 people were present at the meeting, all masked. And they kind of talked about a couple of different things that they wanted to see changed. And one big thing that was noted by the MBTA representative is that they will hire a line manager. And what a line manager does is that they will be boots on the ground watching and kind of being in charge of the placement of these trains. So really being able to make sure that these trains are going to the right places when they're idling, and then instruct them if they're in the wrong locations. And so that position has not been filled yet, but I was confirmed that that they will be hiring somebody. So the position has been created. They're just looking to fill that position, and then they will put that person in place. Actually, last night, there's another community meeting that happened over at the West Gloucester shooting range. So all within West Gloucester, believe it or not. So the shooting range discussion was amongst lots of over 100 West Gloucester residents. Police Chief Ed Connolly, City Councilors Melissa Cox and Sean Nolan. But this was to talk about a change in an ordinance that talks about the West Gloucester shooting range and what's allowed, what's not allowed in that area. And so this change in ordinance had been done in April, and it talked about what is allowed to happen and when can the police be practicing their firearms in that location, that shooting range. And so residents felt that when this ordinance was changed, that there was a lack of communication between the city council and the residents. Now, everything, as Melissa Cox said at the meeting, was done by the letter of the law, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the communication was as expansive and as detailed as the residents really felt that they deserved. And so they had concerns about hikers in the area, about their dogs. One girl was concerned that if her dog were to run off, what would happen if the dog ran into the area of the shooting range. And so, and people were talking about the noise as well. There hasn't been shooting for a while, but now that the police are going to be needing to do their biannual qualifications and their training for every single firearm that they have in the department, things are going to kind of ramp up.
What's the fallout from the positive test over at East Gloucester Elementary?
Yeah, so earlier this week, East Gloucester Elementary School reported that they had one positive case of COVID-19. The person has not been identified, nor will they be identified to the public. Superintendent Ben Lemus had informed me earlier this week. And so they have taken lots of protocols, they've cleaned everywhere. And as of now, they're still doing school as they had been doing prior to the positive test result, and they're still doing it now. Obviously, that those people who were in close contact, again, that's being within 6 feet distance for 15 minutes or more, Those people have been notified privately, and anybody who has children or are faculty and staff who didn't have close contact were still sent an email kind of informing them that this did happen and that they are cleaning and that they are trying to make sure that everything is as sanitized as possible, and kind of continue to encourage those mitigation practices that we've all been talking about here in the city as things do, as we do begin to see rise in COVID, both here in the city and in the national demographics. So.
Gotcha. Great work. We'll check in with you next week.
All right. Have a great weekend, guys.
Back with John once again from Rockport, stuff to tell us about all the things happening in Rockport, and there's always something happening in Rockport. John, what is the latest?
This is kind of wild, right? Because this has happened to me too. You go to the transfer station in the winter, and there's this area right between where they have two of the containers where you have to take plastics and paper and whatever, right? There's this area that anytime it rains, there's this huge puddle that's like 3 cars wide, and nobody ever wants to park there, right? Because sometimes it's like 2-3 inches deep, and other times it's frozen solid, right? So people started talking about the fact that in the winter, it actually becomes an ice rink, and somebody was talking about having fallen there last winter, right? And what are they going to do about leveling that spot or getting it to drain properly or whatever, right? And then somebody chimed in and said, well, it has to do with the fact that the dump is built on landfill, and the layer on top is very thin of like asphalt or concrete or whatever's on top. And to do it right, they might have to touch into the landfill, and then that goes into all kinds of mass DEP stuff, and the state will be on them, and it'll be a nightmare. Folks from the DPW chimed in and said, well, they had been planning on doing something, but everything was frozen last year because of the town's financial situation, right? But then I'm wondering, okay, but what happened with all of the money allocated to the DPW for repair of the barn? Because they got the $12 million that they were looking for the repair of the barn.
To build the barn. I think
to
it's
build,
a whole
yeah,
new barn.
Yeah, basically they have to
Yeah.
completely raise the thing and start from scratch and build a whole new structure. Look, if you can put a piecemeal fix in, don't do it right, just ameliorate the problem temporarily, because if not, the town's going to have a lawsuit on its hands. It's going to cost a lot more than the repair of some asphalt that's 3 parking spaces wide, you know? Sometimes there's issues with allocation, right? I don't know if you guys have heard recently, but there was the water issue. I don't know if we talked about that here, you know, because we're in the middle of the drought,
Right.
and the water quality is really deteriorating in Rockport, and everybody's water. I mean, I know my water has been smelling like swamp water. You know, it comes out, and it, even though it's clear on the days that it's clear, but it smells. It's like stinks, right?
Mm.
And I'm not sure if this has to do with the fact that they decided not to invest in the equipment that they needed to, I don't know if it's properly filter the water, or in the upgrade that they needed to filter the water in the quantity that they had anticipated. That was a big discussion over the summer. So now, in the midst of this drought, then we're feeling the drawbacks of going with, you know, the half measured issue of filtering the water the way they're doing, which is like a Band-Aid, right? So there's a lot that goes into where do you really allocate the funds in the most important things that are core to the structure of the town, right? So like the water supply has got to be one of the most core issues of all. And Rockport's lucky because we have incredible water. You know, we have great water.
Yeah.
But,
And the team that takes care of it is really dedicated to that work.
oh, totally.
Well, I just think it's really interesting that for years you look at these town emergency funds and you think, oh, that's never going to be touched, you know, because we're all so safe and happy in this country. And here we have, you know, a national crisis, and it comes down to, can we fix the puddle at the transfer station?
Yeah.
You know, so people don't slip. It's as basic as that.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like a basic breakdown of stuff like that that's going on. And and Rockport's just as affected as most other places, you know.
Just real quickly, John, did anyone from the town respond on either the water issue, the water quality issue, or the issue at the transfer station?
We're well aware that it needs to be fixed, and it's on our agenda again this week. That's Bruce Reed responding into the issue at the transfer station. The water quality, I think, is a longer term issue, and they're saying, well, you know, that's going to be an issue until the reservoirs fill up some more this winter. So they're basically waiting for Mother Nature to bring the water level back up for the quality to improve. So I don't know how sustainable that is in the long term.
All right, John, thanks for that. Let's follow up with you next week and learn a little bit more about how early voting is going on in Rockport, okay?
Cool, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
We're here with Erica from the Manchester Cricket. Erica, let's talk about an increasing speed limit.
Yeah, well, changing speed limits is really what it is. The town of Manchester has a very long recent history, and by very long, I mean the last 3 years, of sort of this moving puck of speed limits around town. It really started because about 3 years ago, between 2 and 3 years ago, let's call it 3 years ago, there was a big movement that was successful to lower the speed limits in a very, very blunt way across the entire town to 20 miles an hour. So really what happened 3 years ago, and this was very popular at the Board of Selectmen meeting when they first said, we're going to make this happen, came from the Bike and Pedestrian Committee. They wanted to lower all the speed limits for a mile radius around the town train station. You'd think, well, that's not that big of a deal. It basically encompasses all of the inner downtown and outside, the band right outside of it. So think about it. If you were coming from Essex, and we have a regionalized school system, obviously, from Essex. So back then you had parents, a stream of parents who would be dropping off their kids for elementary school, middle school, and high school. They come from, you know, Southern Ave, and they're going 40 miles an hour, and they're legal. And then suddenly they get the most incredible welcome mat into the town of Manchester, 20 miles an hour. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
so that began to chip away. Things like that is a great example of why it started to chip away. They started to get, like, you know, complaints about, listen, does it really need to be 20 miles an hour? It just felt so hostile.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you want to balance out walkability. So here's what's happened. The state has now gotten involved. They started getting involved a while ago because the statewide lowest speed limit is 25 miles an hour. You really have to do something special to create an exception. So the state now has gotten involved, and now they've been heard. And the town will finally now develop areas, you know, that have these kinds of exceptions. And the truth is that, and by the way, I should say, that Essex example, the town relented and actually changed that to 35 miles an hour. So there's a little bit of a buffer before you got to 20 miles an hour, which was a little more reasonable. Well, now they're going to get even more reasonable, and they're going to sort of parse it out. I think one of the most interesting things that might happen is that the true inter-downtown, I'm talking about the retail strip, where we really want to encourage people to walk and to stay, or maybe a connection between that area and the limited commercial district, which is around the 128 area, where we don't know what that's going to be over time, but we want to encourage walkability there as well. We might have areas that might be in the inner downtown lower than 20 miles an hour. I don't think that'll happen, but I can see, you know, that some of these curves, and if people are out in the summer walking between stores or between restaurants, they might want to know that things are going to be super slow. So
Will
there
you
you
think there'll be a speed limit on the walking speed at some point? So you also spoke with the new owners of the Cedar Hill Farm B&B.
Yeah, the Cedar Hill Farm B&B is on a really historic piece of property over in Essex. The property itself dates back to, get this, 1695. Think about that for a second.
I love that.
They've got I think they predate a lot of, you know, I mean, they're just incredible property, 18 acres, several barns, several structures. It's been around for a long time, and it's been in the Ginn family, and this is relevant later, but it's been in the Ginn family. Michael and Jane Ginn, that's Jane with a Y. They have owned it because Michael grew up there starting in, I think his family bought it in 1958. So it's been in his family for a really long time. So they have new owners now, but the new owners is a very interesting story. And it was written actually by Donna Paul, who's a really fantastic writer. But it's now owned by a gay couple, Drew Godfrey and Justin O'Keefe Kane. Now, they had a dream. They were in the south end of Boston, and Drew worked in the cruise industry, so he's in the travel industry. Justin is from Newbury, Massachusetts, so they kind of were drawn to the North Shore, had a plan to move here sometime in 2021. You know what they did instead? They bought a B&B and moved and bought it and closed on it in the height of the escalating pandemic in May.
Oh, really?
Now, those are movers and shakers. Smart kids.
I mean, you gotta, and what they've done with it is they've kind of just sort of modernized it and kind of refreshed it. And what they did was they ended up doing something super creative. And this is sort of the reveal of the story. They ended up buying a subdivided part of the larger property from the Gins, and the Gins are still there. And they have become so close. They talk to each other every day. They share a dog. They share a Labrador.
That's the way to have a Labrador.
There are no fences over there between the yards. I noticed.
The Gins, exactly. The Gins' daughter, Allie, she calls Drew and Justin her brothers. It's this really sweet, lovely story that kind of feels very modern. It feels very modern about sort of community and people coming together and welcoming people in. And then the Gins are really delighted to see the kinds of things that Drew and Justin are doing with the property, but at the same time, and the business. But Drew and Andrew are very sensitive about the Gins. So the Gins are saying, listen, we would never have had a yoga retreat here maybe before, but they had one a couple of months ago. They had a plein air workshop that was very sort of upscale and really incredible. I was there for a little bit of it, and it looked like I wanted to join. So it's kind of refreshing, and it's a great story.
Erica, we're running out of time, but we want to talk quickly about in-person early voting, and then you have a special story about the Chowder House.
Both, I mean, there's just dates for next week. Next week begins in-person early voting for both Manchester and Essex. It starts on Saturday. All the details are online, but it's Saturday, October 17th. And another date, though, that really quickly, is Thursday, October 15th. It gives us a little glimmer about next summer and what things might be like after the pandemic. In Manchester, residents can reserve the Chowder House for next year. That's a real right of the year. If you can get your reservation in early, you're in, and they're gonna have it. And it just is really nice because it makes you think maybe next summer is gonna feel a little more normal. It won't be normal, but a little more normal.
Oh, now I'm in the mood for lunch. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you.
Guys, thanks.